The book that I am holding in my crotch right here is a very interesting one. As you can see, it's called Munich, and it's by Robert Harris. Some of you may remember Robert Harris, pardon me, from his book Fatherland, which I think was published sometime in the 90s, if I'm not mistaken. It's set in an alternate universe or alternate world. It's a counterfactual, that's what they call those stories, where history is different or went in a different direction. And Fatherland is about if the Nazis, Germans, had won World War II. And it's set in the 60s. And this novel is set in our timeline, but it's set just before the war, when there's wars and rumors of wars and rumblings of war breaking out across Europe. And what I find most interesting about this book, and I will admit, I like to think of myself as a literate person, but on the other hand, I'm also kind of a cinephile and cinema junkie, and I have my appreciation for / addiction to the visual arts. I watch a lot of movies. That is to say, some good, some bad. And this book came to my attention, I have to admit, from it being adapted into a Netflix movie, which is also pretty good, which stars Jeremy Irons, who I gather is one of the few showbiz conservatives out there. I've heard anyway. But Jeremy Irons plays the role of the Prime Minister. And when you think Prime Minister, late 30s, England, or if you think heroic Prime Minister, late 30s England, most people, I'm not saying people who watch my, the demographic of people who watch my channel, but the vast majority of people would think a heroic Prime Minister in England in the 1930s, well, that's got to be Churchill. In fact, this book and the movie that's made from it, but it was a book first, published in 2017. This book is basically an effort to rehabilitate Chamberlain. Neville Chamberlain was the Prime Minister before Churchill, and he mostly gets saddled these days with the label of appeaser. He gets saddled with the label of coward. He gets saddled with the label of man who refused to stand up to tyranny and to the expansionist policies of the Nazis and so forth. That's the way Neville Chamberlain is mostly spoken of in history today. He's the one who came back after having a meeting in Czechoslovakia with Hitler, or not in Czechoslovakia, but on the subject of Czechoslovakia and the Sudetenland, the more Germanic part of Czechoslovakia. He came back, got off his plane, and said, talked about how he and Hitler had reached an agreement, and that this was peace in our time. And that phrase, peace in our time, has become seen, in a scathing way, and he's been, again, often treated rather disparagingly by later would-be historians and so forth. But the fact is, as is revealed in the book, this is a fictionalized account of what took place, but it's a historical fiction, and it seems that Robert Harris in this book is essentially trying to make an effort to rehabilitate Neville Chamberlain. What he argues, or what he should, and I'm going to get into how this all relates today, because I began reading this book when things were heating up a little bit in the Ukraine, but I never thought things would get to where they are today. I never thought we'd see a full-scale attack on Ukraine by the Russians, which is happening now. And of course, I know it's a complex issue, and please don't come at me with it's not an invasion, or I don't know. Don't. I'm trying to simplify it as best I can, and I know people out there feel strongly one way or the other, and I try to. I'm not a geopolitical expert by any means. I try not to go out of my depth talking about things that I don't really know much about. But what Harris, the point that Harris makes in this book is he shows us a Prime Minister Chamberlain who was very anxious to maintain peace. There were it was at the time 1938. It was just barely 2 decades since the end of World War I, which was the most awful war the world had ever seen. So much death and destruction, so many young lives wiped out or injured, reduced to vegetables, or at least terribly disabled, shell-shocked by this trench warfare that was so horrifyingly destructive. And he didn't want to return to that, and most of the Western world did not want to return to that. And there was also a consensus had formed amongst some people at this point that the treatment of Germany by the Allies was quite vindictive. The Versailles Treaty was meant to humiliate the Germans, and it was out of that woundedness and humiliation that there arose National Socialism, which grew into the force that it did, that it eventually took over the nation, and at this point in the 30s was actively on the march, wanting to subjugate most of Europe to it. So it was a action reaction. You kick somebody's face in the mud, and humiliate them there, and what you've made is a lifelong enemy and a vengeful enemy, and you've created a monster. And so Robert Harris, again the author, talks about how Chamberlain speaks of Chamberlain not as a coward, not as an appeaser, not as someone who just went into these negotiations and blinked and gave his enemy everything he wanted, and wouldn't stand up for those who were being invaded by this new regime that had grown out of Germany and was expanding into other neighboring countries. And though the book doesn't portray Neville Chamberlain as perfect in any way, it's not a hagiography, it is sympathetic ultimately, and it makes certain points that you have rarely heard made about Neville Chamberlain. If you're a History Channel watching kind of person, or if you have some kind of if you're a kind of armchair historian, if you have a fascination with history, but you basically believe what you're told about history, and of course history is written by the winners, as we all know. The Chamberlain that emerges in this book is one who is actually quite wise and prudent, and one who, yes, wants to do everything he can to maintain the peace, but also he's one who is practical and aware of certain things. He deep down knows that there's not going to be really much of a chance to reason with this new regime that really wants to expand. I don't even think this regime's supporters or defenders could say that they didn't want to expand. The National Socialist regime in Germany was an expansionist imperial force. The idea was not just we'll get back our pride and our dignity, we'll have an air force again, which the Versailles Treaty stripped from us, and we'll get certain lands that should be ours, and we'll peacefully annex Austria and those sorts of things, where most of the Austrians wanted to be annexed anyway, so it wasn't a huge deal. It was a bloodless coup, but ultimately they had their sights on fighting a bloody war to take over much of Europe and also push into the east for more Lebensraum. Now, the Chamberlain of this book, he's quite aware of all of that. But what he ultimately does in securing this temporary peace, he's quite aware that it's going to be temporary. But he knows that this gives the British more time to rearm and to mobilize, which they didn't have before. If the war had begun in 1938, England would definitely have been caught with its pants down and would have been very vulnerable. But they had, after making peace, or reaching an agreement that some said was an appeasement of the National Socialist regime, what came out of that was peace, a temporary peace, a peace of about a year, but that gave a peace that gave England time to prepare for the inevitable. That's the analysis that's given here of Chamberlain, and I think it's interesting, and I do think that, while I'm not a historian myself, you do get so much. There's so much worshipful talk of Winston Churchill, and really Winston Churchill had a lot of flaws. He was a really bad man in a lot of ways. He just gave great speeches. He had a way with words, and I do admire his way with words. I do. As a rhetorician, he is top notch. I was just thinking about his term for Russia as a mystery wrapped in an enigma inside of a riddle, or something like that, something along those lines. He could throw off those kind of bon mots very well. But Churchill was not this heroic figure that is this kind of hagiographically heroic figure that is shown, that we're told by the History Channel types. And Chamberlain is not this weak, soy boy appeaser type either. And one thing that he does that is very wise and very prudent is Chamberlain in the book insists on getting Hitler's signature, like saying we have no territorial ambition beyond this point. And so he comes back to England after getting Hitler's signature on this form. He holds it up and says, here's what, Hitler swore this to me, Herr Hitler, as he calls him. He's always very respectful of him, in the language that he uses. But he did this not because he thought that Hitler would actually honor his promise or what he signed on to there, but rather because he believed, and this broke his heart because he didn't want another war, but he thought it was perhaps inevitable at this point. And since he came back and got this signed form saying that Hitler had pledged not to aggress anymore, then when he did aggress again, it was transparent to everyone, that he was not a man of his word, and that he did not. He signed this agreement with his fingers crossed behind his back, and that gave a certain clarity to just what this regime was and what they were all about. So it's an interesting book that I would recommend, and it's very newly relevant considering what's happening now in Ukraine. I'm not saying that Putin is Hitler and that Ukraine is the Sudetenland, there are parallels. Certainly, you'd be foolish to say that it's just the same situation all over again, like the neocons would say, without hesitation. But you would also be foolish to say it has absolutely nothing in common with this earlier event involved in the 20th century, which also involved Eastern Europe or Central Europe. So let me know if you have read this book, or if you saw the movie on Netflix. Let me know your thoughts. And also, I'm going to do another video, maybe today, maybe later on, maybe tomorrow, where I hone in a little bit more on the Russia-Ukraine stuff. I think it's important to talk about it. Again, even though I'm not, this is not my area of expertise. I don't claim any knowledge about geopolitical events, history, or analysis, but I still do think it's something that it would be important to cover here. So thanks for watching. My name's Andy Nowicki. Check out my work at altrightnovelist.com. My latest book, The Insurrectionist, can be purchased from terrorhousepress.com.